For me personally, my favorite thing about this episode of Goblin Slayer was not the action, it was not the gore, it was an amazingly funny scene where the priestess realized that she was no longer going to be the only one covered with goblin blood. Misery really does love company. The bloody adventures of Goblin Slayer continue in another dungeon-crawling episode, filled with high-octane action and lots of monster slaying. This also was the very first episode where we got to see Goblin Slayer go up against something that was not a goblin. He basically fought against an ogre, which at the end of the day is basically just a really big goblin, but it ended up being the most unique battle of the entire series, as well as giving us a nice glimpse of the dynamic that he's going to have with these brand new characters, the High Elf Archer, the Dwarf Shaman, and the Lizard Priest. Right off the bat, if you find yourself a fan of Dungeons & Dragons, you're certainly going to like this episode, as it really feels like playing a game of just that, except that it's soaked with all sorts of anime gore and blood. In fact, Orcbold the Goblin Slayer himself seems to be a connoisseur of blood in many ways, as every single time they're about to go into one of these caves, he ends up drenching himself with this stuff, and he ends up doing this to the High Elf Archer, who is not too thrilled about being covered with blood, but like I said at the beginning of the review, just seeing Priestess's reaction to this is awesome, as she's been through the ringer a couple of times, and it's probably refreshing to know that she's no longer alone in being covered in goblin juices. Most of this episode is dedicated to Goblin Slayer and his team making their way through this goblin fortress, which seems to go underground in all these different winding paths. They even find this one elf girl who has been captured, and it appears at first as almost she wants to be killed, but Goblin Slayer is the only one paying attention to the minor details in the room, and realizes she simply just wants to be saved by one of these marauding goblins, which of course he does do in an amazingly violent and awesome fashion. What I really love about this scene, however, is getting to see more of the other side characters and their unique abilities. We already know that the High Elf Archer has the ability to fire arrows like a friggin' badass, but what about the Lizard Priest? What is his entire deal? Lizard Priest actually has the ability to communicate with his ancient ancestors, which all seem to be dinosaur related, such as iguanodons and velociraptors, and when he does this, he can do a number of things. One, he can summon this really awesome sword, which is essentially just a giant velociraptor claw, or he can quite literally summon a living skeletal version of his very own people, which he can use as either backup or to actually perform tasks for him. Basically, he summons a skeletal lizard warrior, and he uses this to actually help out this elf girl, and even later on in a battle against a giant ogre, which is without a doubt one of the most thrilling things about the episode. But before we get to that, we get to see how efficient all of these characters are when they combine all of their unique abilities. They come to this one room which is filled with all of these goblins, to the point where they're not going to be able to take them all out if they just rush in like frickin' madmen. So they come up with this plan where the dwarf does this mystical dance while spitting this wine over this entire room, and the priestess casts this spell which puts all of the goblins to sleep, allowing them to sort of go around and slaughter them one by one. However, the sudden silence gains the attention of their leader, this massive, super pissed off looking ogre, who manages to dominate the team for the most part with his overall massive frame. But we get to see that even under these circumstances, the Goblin Slayer manages to come up with an amazing strategy. In fact, that's what I think is my favorite thing about him. He never underestimates goblins and does everything to a T when it comes to taking them down, knowing that while they are small and weak, they themselves are incredibly unpredictable and can be very dangerous. But when it comes to bigger monsters, they always have a giant glaring weakness, and he always seems to have some sort of trick up his sleeve. He manages to take out this goblin with this scroll, which he opens up, which is actually a summoning gate. And this summoning gate was placed at the bottom of the ocean. So essentially, whenever he opens this up, the portal opens and all of this water suddenly rushes through with a great amount of pressure, to the point where it basically is like a giant blade, and it manages to completely cut this giant ogre in half. The Goblin Slayer then manages to finish him off with one more swing of his sword. This scene right here was incredibly awesome and unique, and I don't think anybody could have predicted that he had such unique magical abilities, aside from simply his ability to use a torch, a sword, and a shield. Really, when it comes to the Goblin Slayer, looks can be deceiving, and I can't wait to see what other sort of tricks he's going to utilize against even crazier monsters as we go about this series. So, what's the rundown on this episode of Goblin Slayer? Definitely the best episode of the series thus far. Finally getting to see the team work together and utilize their unique abilities is great. The characters don't have names yet, but they still have a tremendous amount of personality, and they all really get to do something really great in this episode. I mean, I didn't even mention all of the scenes with the archer and the dwarf shaman and the lizard priest as they're fighting against the ogre at the end. We get to see all of their unique abilities. I love the fact that the dwarf himself can actually summon all of these stones or get the ones around him in the ground, and can control them like projectiles. He kind of reminds me of an earthbender from Avatar: The Last Airbender, to be perfectly honest, but still getting to see him in action doing all these crazy dances to cast his spells or to manipulate rocks is really freaking awesome. I especially love the lizard priest, though, being able to call upon his dinosaur ancestors to utilize abilities like summoning a skeleton who can help him in battle, or even summoning like that giant velociraptor claw sword. That alone is just so damn cool. I really do love it. But again, Goblin Slayer is the one who kind of steals the show in this one by using that summoning gate to cut open this ogre in what might be one of the most surprising action scenes that I've seen from the show. It also is a promise that we'll get to see increasingly crazier battles as this goes on. We're going to see more than goblins. We're going to see a lot of crazy fantasy monsters, and I can't wait to see how this super dark D&D crew is going to take them all down. So overall, I thought this was another pretty solid episode of Goblin Slayer. Not the greatest thing in the world, but who can deny that this is still a really entertaining and fun series to watch. I'm going to give this episode a 4 out of 5, and you guys should definitely check it out. If any of you did watch the episode, make sure to tell me what you thought about it in the comment section below, and what you hope to see from the rest of Goblin Slayer. I will see you all next time, and as always, stay down now, baby.